But when you go into interviews, when you go into conversations with stakeholders and legitimately want what's best for the other person as opposed to just trying to get things checked off of a list, I don't know. I think it means something. I think people pick up on that, and I think we're better off for it.
This episode is brought to you by Green Skies Analytics, an audit analytics service provider that works with internal audit departments that have data analysts and are still frustrated with trying to make analytics actually work, aren't getting the expected ROI, who can't break through the communication barrier between the analysts and the audit team, and those that need experienced direction for an audit analytics strategy and process. Those that feel like they've wasted time and money on trainings, aren't getting the value they want, not prioritizing the highest risk areas for the organizations, or have projects that seemingly never get completed. Do you deal with any of that? If you do, go to the show notes of this episode and click the Green Skies Analytics link, or go to greenskiesanalytics.com to schedule a call and understand how Green Skies Analytics makes analytics actually work for internal audit.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Audit Podcast. I'm your host, Trent Russell, and today on the show, we have Dave Dufek. He's the Chief Internal Auditor at Principal Financial Group. Some of the things we hit on, we recorded this one a while back, so, for the avid listeners, you might know that at one point we were asking if emojis were appropriate in emails, and so we do have that on the question list, as well as how Dave decides what goes on the audit plan so that he's auditing what matters. The reason I emphasize auditing what matters is Dave and I both have, this appreciation for Norman Marks' book, Auditing What Matters. And so it's the most highlighted book that I own, audit related or otherwise. So if you're an internal audit, cannot recommend that book enough. If you're on just SOX side, so that's all you do is SOX stuff, Norman has a great book on SOX as well, so I'd check that one out. And if you're on both sides, get them both. We also talk about how to scope an audit, which we hear a lot of people struggle with is scope creep especially, but then how do you scope it and how do you auditing the right thing basically, and how do you know that you're doing that? And then Dan also mentioned during the pre-recording, he uses this metric of audits completed per FTE or full-time employee, but he's like, it's really not that great. Like, what? Considering the appreciation we have for Norman and how he might feel about that, we kind of took a deep dive into, well, why are you measuring that thing that you said is really not great? There's some additional context that Dave adds, which actually makes it a pretty good metric. But I think just kind of initially when you hear that, you go, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. Audits per FTE, who cares? It should be about the risk and how it ties to the org strategy. And if we're auditing what matters, then it doesn't really matter how many we do in the budget and all that kind of good stuff. So anyway, we hit on that, and then we talk about what is on Dave's audit wish list. Here we go. What is in either your internet browsing history or your ChatGPT or Llama or any other LLM that you might use? What have you been looking into lately?
Yeah, what hasn't? What's not in the browser or the ChatGPT history? I'm experimenting a lot. I think one of the things that's most interesting to me lately is Notebook LM. Uploading a number of different white papers or other sort of documents and having the custom podcast show up. Hopefully, Trent, that doesn't cause you any sort of competition, but to get some basic information and listen in the car to something I'm interested about. And what I'm interested about can be certainly audit information, new regulations, but it can also be things I'm just curious about, like, tell me about how AI works, or tell me how to audit AI. And, that was an interesting one where I uploaded 4 or 5 different position papers from different think tanks. And it did a pretty good job of really sort of outlining, these are the 3 things that, we would all pretty much think about. And there's this other 4th theme that ran across all of the papers that, really prompted some discussion. So experimenting with that for sure. I'll play with ChatGPT like anybody else, but one of the more recent successes, I think, is I have a Peloton and a Tonal, and I was curious as to whether or not the new model would be able to really get at a custom nutrition and workout plan for me based on the actual classes that are in those platforms. And it did. It understood my goals. It laid something out that really, kind of by specific class and specific target. So, I'm no nutrition expert or exercise scientist, but again, it's just really interesting to see it start to put the pieces together.
I had two follow-ups to that. One, what was that fourth theme that you were talking about?
Well, really splitting out, I think, the way that we think about testing. And so we'll think about governance, we'll think about the application itself, we'll think about the models. I think it was approaching how do you get at testing when we know that the model will spit out a slightly different result every time it asks the question, and that either is due to the randomness that's in the information, the sort of training data, or the model design itself, or just the day. As models get tweaked, new information comes online, you are going to get some different information. So what is that drift, I think, over time? And how much comfort can you really take if you test something on September 19th? Do you know that that's actually indicative of how that's going to perform a week later?
Yeah, and that's one of those where, it's a feature, not a bug type of lines come from. So if they didn't create it to where it would give you basically a different answer every time, that it would just be, not only obviously would you get the same thing, but then it's not really doing the predictive thing as well. It's just like spitting out and being more rule based. So it's actually a good thing that it is slightly different each time, because that's where it kind of does its thinking. And then on the Notebook LM, so just real quick for those that don't know that, it is what Dave was talking about and why it's potentially problematic for the Audit Podcast. You can take pretty much anything. Let's just take a blog article or like a really long white paper, something like that. And you go, hey, I don't have time to read this, but I've got a 30-minute commute. You can upload it into Notebook LM and it turns it into a podcast, except it is really, really good. And it's conversational. There's a host. Or two hosts. I guess you can kind of pick and play with it as you like. But there's what blew me away was the act of listening between the host and to hear him go, yeah, that's interesting. Can you tell me more about XYZ? And I was like, holy that is nuts. So we've done some things. We're gonna likely publish an episode that's just that as like a teaser, just so people can use it and be familiar with it and know that it is an option. But yeah, we don't have we're not looking to do that consistently. And what I've kind of thought was funny is with podcasts historically, and we got this request a little bit, was, hey, can you take the audio and turn it into text? Because I don't have time to listen to the audio. I'd much rather scan the text. And we're like, yeah, sure. That's not a huge problem. And now it's, hey, can you take this text and turn it into audio? Because I don't have time to read the text. I'm like, what are we doing in this world?
Well, I think to your point, though, the fact that it is interactive and it feels semi-human and there seems to be some personality in it is different than just sort of text to speech. And so it, helps to process things. My wife thinks I'm a giant nerd because I'm running things in front of her, look at what AI did, or look what I was able to do with Claude. And, she'll roll her eyes 80% of the time. But, when I played a couple of these podcasts for her, she was blown away. I mean, just
that was it.
Wouldn't have been able to tell that was AI, except if you were really listening for that pretty closely.
All right, I'll share that with my sister-in-law then. I showed her the other day. She was in town, and I showed her ChatGPT and just some of the first use cases I did that blew me away. And she just looked at it and she went, oh, "That's cool," and gave it back. My jaw literally dropped the first time I did this. How are you not blown away by this? So maybe that'll be it for it. Hey everybody, we'll get back to the guests, but real quick, just wanted to let you know, block your calendars for March 5th, 2025. If you attended the Audit Analytics and AI conference back in the fall, we're going to do a mini Audit Analytics and AI conference on March 5th. So it's going to be from 9 to 4. So we're going to go 9 to 12. Then we'll do an hour break, and then 1 to 4. These are Central Time, so Chicago time zone. All right, so go ahead, block your calendars off, and we'll make the announcement when registration opens. All right, back to the show. Hot topic here. Emojis in emails. Thumbs up, thumbs down.
I guess I'm lukewarm on it because it'll automatically pop an emoji in if you do the colon dash parenthesis, and I feel comfortable enough to leave in the sort of old style text or ASCII characters, but when it corrects it, I'll backspace to actually make sure there's not kind of a yellow image sitting in there. So I think they're okay. I mean, you start to introduce personality through the methods of communication. some emails obviously doesn't make any sense to do that at all. You need to know your audience. But I think that's true. Email is just one method of communication. Yeah, we have text, we have Teams, we have Slack, we have all sorts of other ways of communicating with each other. And I do think that over time, you're trying to develop some sort of character or emotion in your email, and sometimes that's hard to read. So I guess the sort of compromise I have is where I think something might be misunderstood, and I'm trying to reinforce that this is a friendly statement. This is not this passive aggressive sort of thing I'm trying to remind you of. It was interesting. We had our chief litigator talk to our team just about general trends and themes, and she said, one of the things that she's always thinking about is the way that people use, say, animated GIFs in communications channels. What a litigator doesn't want to do is come back and have somebody on the stand explain why they have a dumpster in their Teams or their Slack message. And so I think emoji use, animated GIFs, but do think about, is that something where you want to explain why you put a winky emoji in your email?
Yeah. Can you explain what a pineapple emoji means in this context? Yeah,
Exactly.
that's awesome.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, one of the hotter topics that we've had, if we look at downloads per episode, was basically how to do a risk assessment. I don't know, you and I share similar sentiments on how that should or could be done, largely influenced by Norman Marks as well. For those that don't know, he's been on the show multiple times. Huge fan, probably the go-to thought leader. It's what, when someone says, hey, I want to get into audit, or how can I be better at audit or whatever, I go, just go read all his stuff, go subscribe to his blog. Fantastic resource. Anyway, with that said, how do you go about putting your audit plan together?
Well, really, we're trying to make sure that we're connected to the business, its strategy. If you've had Norman on before, there's nothing new there, but ultimately, truly understanding strategic objectives of the business, that requires real relationships, real connections, real understanding of what the business is trying to accomplish. And we talk about questions like, what keeps you up at night? I hate that question. It's really more of a what's harder than it should be. What are the things that have to go well? And when the business wants to give you a list of the 50 things that have to go well, it's like, no. What are the 3-4 things that have to go well if you're going to meet that objective? And I think that keeps us hopefully grounded in the sense of making sure that the things we're auditing matters to objectives and outcomes. If it doesn't do that, I mean, you can kind of get to a snooze fest. And so that's a big component of the plan, obviously, and assessing the overall risks that we put into the plan. And then, I think I have a good team that keeps me honest for what I'm going to call all the vanilla things that still could go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You're never, if you have good conversations with strategy, you're never really going to have somebody say, you know what, our treasury system has to work well. And so you have to also be aware that that's not a natural topic of conversation, and you need to solve for that. And so, I think we've got a good balance of team members who will challenge each other, poke at things, poke at priorities, and really say, hey, we're paying for audits with audits. And so what sort of profile or character do we have to have covered in the next 12 months, and less coverage of auditable entities, but more coverage of the ideas and the things that are really important to the company.
You mentioned I think the way you stated was what truly the strategic objectives are. And I think maybe the way you said that was, and hit on the word truly, is because strategic objectives, they may be out there, but that's not necessarily always the case. And even if it is, things change a lot. And so I know, like, when we talk about auditing its strategic objectives, one of the biggest kind of what ifs or issues people have is, how do we truly know what those are? If I boiled it down, it'd probably be just based on the relationship. But is it through your questioning techniques, or how do you figure out truly what the strategic objectives are? Like the ones that aren't in the PowerPoint from the 1 week offsite with the executives to just, figure out what they are. How do you figure that out?
Yeah, I think it starts there, and having the right relationship with the strategy team. And again, we're fortunate to have that. But you talk to strategy, you talk to capital markets, you talk to the risk function, and you really try to get an understanding of, what is it we've promised? I mean, you can start with not just the glossy materials that come away from the offsite, but also the standard investment materials. Sometimes there are promises made in a section or an area like ESG that aren't explicitly part of strategy, but they're out there, and it's a public sort of statement. But then you start peeling it back, and you hit on it. It ultimately comes down to interviewing techniques and relationship. Does somebody trust you enough to be able to say, okay, yeah, the strategy that we've laid out in that deck is actually a 5-year journey. So what are you really going to be able to see in the next 6 months or 12 months? It's maybe a sliver of that. And so I really need to understand what's the staging here, what's the order, and what's the importance. And also to be able to push back on it. I mean, really listening to good interviewers, whether they be podcasters, whether they be, old late night show hosts, where you're able to think on the fly and really say, okay, you said this. Now I'm not sure I understand. You're going to have to help walk me through that. That's where you start to really peel, I think, at the strategy. The other piece is I think what's not on the page, which is what you asked about, and every company has their own culture, every company has their own challenges and aspirations. So being able to also just poke at those things, be aware of those things, keep notes about those sorts of things, so that you can come back and say, okay, is this a strategic decision that we've made? We just haven't captured that somewhere. Or is this just inertia that's happened because we've done it that way for 20 years?
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I like that. I want to ask you this real quick, and we'll move on, because I think there is a lot of power in asking a good question. And what keeps you up at night? I mean, it's kind of antiquated almost at this point. Like, I feel like it's been asked so many times that people just kind of gloss over it in their brains if it's asked. Do you have a specific question or two? I know you mentioned two earlier, but do you have one? Like, if this is my go-to question almost.
Yeah, I mean, the two I mentioned earlier are really two of the more important ones, I think, for me. But it's some version of how can we help, and that might get a wry smile from somebody, but ultimately, it may not come out in those words. It may ultimately be, look, what are the things that you need some help with or assurance on? How are you sure that this is actually occurring in your organization? And you have to ask it in such a way. I mean, the reason that the question, what keeps you up at night, doesn't work that well, in my opinion, is you don't want to work for a company where executives are focused on that. Like really, you don't. You want your executive leadership team, your CEO, your CFO, your COO to really be focused on, if you think of the old SWOT matrix, you want them focused on strengths, you want them focused on opportunities, you want them to be risk aware, but you don't want them to dwell there. And because they're not dwelling there, they're really going to pull up, if you do ask a question like that, they're going to pull up the thing that's top of mind because they just heard about a problem, as opposed to the things that they really think could go wrong. And so sometimes that also means that the interviewee has to be a layer down from the senior management. So you're really able to say, okay, this thing that you've been given as a task, where do you see that going sideways?
Okay. I like the way you put it. How are you sure, as opposed to assurance around? Because I feel like, we know assurance, and naturally most people do, but assurance is just another one of those like audit words that we could probably just keep in our back pocket and never use. But
Right.
How are you sure basically answers the same question or asks the same question. So I really like the way you phrase that. Okay. So now we have some semblance of an audit plan. How do you then go about scoping that? Because that's always a big area of concern with folks is, okay, we have this huge thing. How do we kind of carve this up and make sure we're spending our time on the area that matters the most?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is trying to think about the scope in terms of budget. And I think it'll always be a debate when we put a number of hours or a number of weeks or a number of people attached to an audit. Is that prescriptive or descriptive? All right. And I think the answer depends. And so that'll help influence the scope. If I'm telling you, you have no more than 300 hours to look at this area or this project or this process, I'm telling you, you have no more than 300 hours. And so you could come back and tell me that that's inadequate, but we have to have that discussion. There are lots of audits though, where it's a greenfield. We don't know how long it's going to take. You want to audit absolutely as much as you need to, but no more than is necessary. So, it's descriptive. We think it's about this big. We really want you to come back though and let the scope drive the size of the audit. And again, we can talk about what distinguishes those two types of audits, but then we get into scope, and we tried something a few years ago. It actually started with our data area, and then it migrated into the rest of our into our audit team, where we said, look, let's explain or describe the scope in terms of a key question. So much like you said about, you say assurance to business people, their eyes might glaze over. They could understand what you're talking about, but it's not really their language. So we said, look, we really want every audit that we do to answer one key question, not three questions, not a half a question. What is it you're trying to answer? Yes or no to what? Does the process work or doesn't it? Are we able, and what does work mean? Are we able to prevent customer payments from going to the wrong party? Okay, well, now everything I do and must support the answer to the question. And if I'm doing anything that won't answer the question, well, that's a good clue that that's not actually part of the scope. What was interesting is as we played with that, and some auditors hated it, some auditors liked it, but it was a common language we were able to use. I was really surprised by the reaction from the business and the boards that we talked to, because they expressed, well, wait a second. Yeah, this is common language. I know exactly what you said, because I can read a scope table. I can read a scope statement. I've seen those before, but you've actually told me that, is this X? And the answer is yes or no, or maybe. And now I can get my head around that a whole lot faster.
I love that. Have you tweaked that? You said that initiative you kind of started a couple of years ago. Have you tweaked it and grown it, and lessons learned, anything like that? Anything else you could share? Because I think that's a great tactical thing for people to take away. But if you guys have struggled with really making that work, and there's lessons learned that you could share that would prevent others from falling into those, then we'd love to hear those.
Well, no, I think we still use it. We still put the key question on every report that we have, so that is what leads the top of the sort of the right below the title of the report. I think the only hiccup that we've really had that we haven't fully solved for is regulators aren't accustomed to seeing it. So when a regulator walks in, they want to see what the scope table was, and again, we have that in the work papers. We can kind of get into a granular level of, these are the scope points. These are the objectives. Here's your sort of RCM, more traditionally. But sometimes they'll scratch their head a little bit. And so there is a little bit of communication and education that we've gone through. In the end, it's all worked out fine. And the regulators understand what it is we're trying to do, and in being clear with our stakeholders. But it takes a little bit of extra work on that end.
Yeah, I really like that. I'm a big fan of what's the one thing, even down to the day-to-day, what's the one thing that I need to, I have to get this one thing done. If I do nothing else, what's the one thing? And making sure, I used to even take a Post-it note, got dual screens. I would write the one thing and then post it on the other screen. That way I would have to, you get caught up in emails or whatever. And inevitably I'd look over and go, oh yeah, I forgot. I got to do this one thing. That's what I got to come back to. So I love that idea of just the one thing. It's also applicable for anyone interested in dashboard development. This is a hard lesson learned for myself. We built a dashboard that answered 50 different questions, and management went, we're never going to use this. It's way too much.
Exactly.
So it wasn't later on until I realized we usually, the kind of best practice is per dashboard, you answer 3 questions, kind of maybe 5. So I think it falls in line with that, which I really like.
Yeah.
All right. Controversial take here. Controversial question coming in hot. There's a lot of talk around metrics with internal audit. How do we prove our value, KPIs, all that kind of good stuff. And one that I was surprised to hear from you was that you look at the number of audits completed per FTE. And when we talk about value add and things like that, that's usually one where people go yeah, maybe if somebody asks for it, we'll, audit committee asks for it, we'll give it to them, but we don't really care, that much. It's, it's not about how many you get done. It's the quality of the work that you do and all that kind of great stuff. So with that said, what are the benefits of doing that? Why do you look at that one? And then why does it usually have this kind of not negative perception, but we'll just say negative perception for lack of better words.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I'm pleased to hear that you've run into other people who have actually used it or thought about, it that way. I haven't. So here we thought we had a, interesting or unique idea, but um, KPIs are so hard in the world we live in because our product is assurance, warning, advice. Those are hard to measure. Certainly you're looking at quality scores, you're looking at stakeholder surveys, you're looking at the sorts of things that try to give you a pulse as to whether or not folks actually value what you're telling them. But there is an absolute productivity metric that we need to land on. I really dislike completion of the audit plan and some of the more traditional metrics because again, that doesn't really tell me a whole lot about am I getting better or worse if I'm always at 90% completion or 95% completion. So our hypothesis, and yeah, I can get into a moment, all of the reasons it can be gamed, all of the reasons it can be terrible. But both the numerator and the denominator move and they tell us something. So if we're really leaning into your world, we're doing a lot more data analytics. Well, how do we know we're becoming productive? Well, I should be able to generate more audits, or I should be able to reduce my FTEs or redeploy them in other ways. So one or both of those numbers might move if we're actually starting to see some, production in the data space. Are we able to ask better questions are we hiring more talented people? I think all of those things start to again express themselves in the number of audit outputs. And I think you do have to control for and have a good QA function that tells you, well, I'm not just splitting up my 1,000 hour audit into 10, 100 hour audits, and I've suddenly, increased my productivity tenfold. So I think but I think there are some ways to account for that. As to the denominator, I think the other thing it's starting to help us, and it is still pretty new for us, but it's starting to really help us reflect on what's the composition of our team. So the board gives us a pile of money. We can spend that however we want. If we want to hire a whole bunch of traditional auditors, no data analytics, no administrative support, no professional practices operation, really flat organization so we don't have a lot of management. I mean, that's one way to run your organization. As you layer those other things into the organization, a professional practices team, a dedicated QA resource, data analysts who maybe aren't working full-time on actual audits themselves. Okay, well, that's a price that we're paying. That's an investment that we're making that really burdens the denominator. So how do I see that then expressed in continuing to stay focused on what it is we're actually meant to deliver, which is more assurance over time, all things equal. I did read something a long time ago, beware the man of one study. And I think that's the same thing, beware the man of one metric. And so you do have to have compensating metrics for all the reasons you mentioned. Quality can decrease, people can game the system. You also, really absolutely should not use this on an individual or a team basis because it's not about, hey, you auditor, you have to produce X number of audits this year or you've done a lousy job, because again, that will incent cutting corners, some sort of competitiveness that's not healthy. It's really more at the team level or the function level to be able to say, okay, across the entire function, are we comfortable with the direction in which this metric is moving? And the answer might be, yeah. I mean, so ultimately, maybe it's flat because we're making deliberate investments in data analytics. And that team is taking some time to ramp up. And so I think it's okay, but it's really in the way you use it.
Have you, in your time in measuring that and where you've seen movement in that metric, what decisions have you made as a result of that moving up or down or staying flat?
Yeah. Good question. It's a pretty new metric for us, at least in the way I described using it. So I'd say we have about a year under our belt, but we've been looking at it over kind of our audit periods, quarters essentially. And we had a hypothesis entering 2024. We took a core team, we really took them off production audits and said, look, your job for the next 2024 is to go automate as many audits as you can in a meaningful way. we don't really expect you to deliver anything to the numerator. So our hypothesis is we're taking again, it was like a little under 10% of our staff and devoting them to this path. So our hypothesis is that number is going to drop, and we're okay with that. We're making an investment. What we were able to do, though, is monitor. The metric actually went the other direction. The metric did continue to climb northward. Some of that was just the fact that the team was entirely focused on, okay, we understand the sort of cadence here, the metric, we're all rowing in the same direction. So it's helped us to keep that team completely isolated, I think, from production audits and continue to focus on their mission of delivering the automation results.
Sort of start wrapping things up. What is on your internal audit wish list? You get whatever you want. What is it that you want?
Well, if I can wave a magic wand, I think some of what I want is seamless integration into all of the company's data and AI initiatives. The data projects that we have, and again, this near dear to what you do, but we can only go so fast. We can only go at the pace of the company. When you're dealing in a company, and again, this isn't unique to us. This is, I think, any large, complicated company that's been around for a while. You've got lots of legacy systems, lots of disparate data. And so the company's understanding it and solving it and everything, but ultimately you what you don't want to do is go out and build your own environment, build your own lake. And our temptation is to try to get out ahead of that. So man, if I could wave a magic wand, it'd be that, I think. The other piece that we're working on is really how do you test controls better through analytics and automation. So there are ways to do it. We are experimenting with that. But I want the easy button. I don't want to go figure it out, each and every time. And so I think we, like many, are continuing to do probably a lot of substantive testing, and that gives us a probability of controls working. But I think and fear that sometimes we and others might be representing that as a definitive, the control is operating effectively. So just figuring out the easy button there, I think, would be great.
Got it. As the approach you guys are taking, like, hey, let's test 100%, and then, that infers the controls operating effectively, but it doesn't mean that it actually is. So then, do you guys, like, we often recommend, test 100% where you can, but then also at a minimum, understand the design, take a sample of one, walk through it, or a sample of one across the different iterations or the different ways the control can operate, depending on like control owner, people, process, technology, all that kind of good stuff. Is that one way you guys have approached that?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly do those tests, and we do a lot of those in the data analytics space. And you're right, they infer the answer. We've had some success, limited success, and again, very careful about this because of the implications that we can have. But you try to send data should kick out. You try to send data that should fail, and can we do that in an automated way to see that the control actually catches or stops something from happening? That's not applicable for everything. You certainly don't want to do that in a security way. You don't want to do that in a way that, or an insecure way. You don't want to do that in a way that's going to disrupt the production environment. But where you can take a shot at that, there are some automated ways that you can get right at the control.
Got it. All right. Is there? I'll give the floor to you. The stage is yours. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with?
One thing I've just been reflecting on lately, and at the risk of sounding like a softie or whatever, just been reflecting about, how we spend time with our work teams, the people we work with and for, and the people who work for us. And you spend a lot more time with those people sometimes than you do your family, just in the, course of a week. And, I just the need for us to love, if that's not too strong of a word, to love each other and really to want what's best for our team members. I think as internal auditors, that sounds weird, but when you go into interviews, when you go into conversations with stakeholders and legitimately want what's best for the other person, as opposed to just trying to get things checked off of a list, I don't know. I think it means something. I think people pick up on that, and I think we're better off for it. If you walk around with that attitude in your heart and on your mind, it gets you through the week and through your career in a way that a little more uplifting.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Audit Podcast. Whatever platform you're listening on right now, I'm sure there's a subscribe button somewhere, so please hit the subscribe button there. If you're listening through iTunes or Spotify, feel free to go give us that 5-star rating. It only took me about 16 seconds to give myself a 5-star review, and it really helps to get future guests to come on the show, so we'd really appreciate that. Lastly, be sure to check out the show notes and follow us on all our social media channels on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and on TikTok. Also, if interested, please sign up for our weekly newsletter from the Audit Podcast. Thank you all. Have a great one.